The dinner bell rang across Camp Hearn, Texas, on a sweltering July evening in 1944, as German prisoner of war Obergefreiter Hans Müller lined up for what would become the most psychologically devastating meal of his military career. On his aluminum tray sat a thick beefsteak, mashed potatoes with real butter, fresh green beans, white bread, and a slice of apple pie that seemed to mock every assumption he held about American character and wartime sacrifice. Müller had been captured during the Normandy fighting after months of subsisting on increasingly meager German rations. His last letter from home described his wife rationing black bread and turnip soup for their 2 children, while his elderly mother had lost 30 pounds since the Allied bombing intensified. The contrast between his family's desperate hunger and the abundance before him was almost unbearable to comprehend. What Müller didn't understand was that he was experiencing American industrial abundance applied to humanitarian purposes, even toward enemy soldiers. While German civilians queued for bread made with sawdust substitutes and boiled potato peels for sustenance, American POW camps were serving meals that exceeded the nutritional standards most Germans had enjoyed even before the war began. The irony was cruel and complete. German prisoners in America were eating better than German officers in Berlin, better than German factory workers, and infinitely better than the families they had left behind to defend the fatherland. This wasn't just a meal. It was evidence of systematic abundance that would challenge everything Müller believed about warfare, sacrifice, and the nation he had sworn to protect. If you want to discover more incredible stories of how American abundance created moral complexity even in the darkest moments of World War II, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Obergefreiter Hans Müller's last meal in Germany had been watery potato soup with ersatz bread made from sawdust, acorn flour, and whatever grain could be scavenged from bombed storage facilities. By summer 1944, German military rations had deteriorated to 1,800 calories daily for frontline troops, while civilian allocations dropped to 1,200 calories that barely sustained life for non-working adults and children. The systematic starvation of Germany had begun long before Müller's capture at St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge. Allied strategic bombing had targeted not just military installations, but the agricultural and food distribution networks that sustained civilian populations. Rail lines carrying grain were destroyed, storage facilities were bombed, and transportation systems that moved food from rural areas to cities were systematically eliminated. Müller's correspondence from home painted increasingly desperate pictures of civilian suffering that contradicted Nazi propaganda about German resilience and Allied weakness. His wife Greta wrote about queuing for hours to receive meager rations that often ran out before her turn arrived. Their children, ages 8 and 12, had not tasted meat in over 6 months and survived primarily on turnips, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be grown in backyard gardens. The psychological impact of civilian hunger extended beyond physical suffering to encompass social breakdown that undermined German war efforts more effectively than military defeats. Crime rates increased as desperate families stole food from neighbors. Black market activities flourished despite severe penalties, and social cohesion deteriorated under the pressure of resource competition that made cooperation increasingly difficult. Medical reports from German cities documented systematic malnutrition that affected productivity, morale, and resistance to disease among populations that Nazi ideology claimed were racially superior to their enemies. Children showed stunted growth, adults suffered from vitamin deficiency diseases, and elderly citizens died from hunger-related illnesses that better nutrition could have prevented. The contrast with American abundance was apparent even to German soldiers fighting on foreign battlefields. Captured American K rations contained chocolate, processed meat, cigarettes, and coffee that exceeded quality standards for German officer meals during peacetime. Enemy soldiers seemed to waste food that German forces would have treasured as luxury items worthy of careful conservation. Intelligence reports reached German command describing American civilian rationing that allowed meat consumption exceeding German military allocations, sugar availability that German confectioners hadn't seen since 1941, and coffee imports that maintained civilian morale through luxury consumption that German authorities had eliminated to conserve foreign exchange for military imports. The economic mathematics of starvation became clear through systematic analysis of agricultural production that revealed German food shortages as inevitable consequences of strategic decisions rather than temporary difficulties caused by battlefield setbacks. Slave labor had replaced experienced farmers. Synthetic fertilizers were diverted to explosives manufacturing, and transportation priorities favored military supplies over civilian nutrition. Personal morale among German forces reflected growing awareness that their families were suffering more severely than enemy civilians, creating psychological conflicts between military duty and family responsibility that undermined combat effectiveness through worry, guilt, and resentment toward leadership that had promised quick victory while delivering prolonged suffering. The letters from home that reached German soldiers described not just hunger, but social disintegration that challenged fundamental assumptions about national strength, civilian resilience, and the righteousness of continued resistance against enemies who seemed to possess unlimited resources, while German families faced systematic starvation that military victory might no longer be able to remedy. The mess hall at Camp Hearn operated with systematic efficiency that produced 12,000 meals daily for German prisoners of war, each meal containing more protein and calories than most German civilians had consumed in weeks. American abundance applied to enemy welfare exceeded humanitarian requirements through systematic attention to nutrition that treated prisoners as human beings, deserving dignity rather than defeated enemies deserving punishment. Colonel James Patterson, the camp's commanding officer and former livestock specialist from Iowa, had designed meal programs that met American civilian restaurant standards despite serving enemy soldiers. Fresh beef arrived weekly from Texas ranches. Potatoes came from Idaho farms operating without rationing restrictions, and dairy products flowed from Wisconsin cooperatives that maintained peacetime production levels despite global warfare demands. The kitchen operations revealed American agricultural abundance that German prisoners found difficult to comprehend after years of systematic rationing and substitute ingredients. Real sugar-sweetened desserts rather than saccharin alternatives. White flour produced genuine bread instead of ersatz substitutes, and fresh vegetables appeared regularly rather than being reserved for special occasions or high-ranking officials. Quality control procedures ensured consistent nutrition across thousands of daily meals through systematic planning that treated prisoner feeding as logistical problem, requiring industrial solutions rather than humanitarian gesture dependent on individual compassion. Statistical sampling verified nutritional content. Standardized portions ensured fairness, and systematic preparation maintained quality despite massive scale. The economic implications gradually became apparent to German observers who understood that American prisoner feeding represented routine expense rather than strategic burden. Food costs were absorbed without apparent strain on civilian rationing. Agricultural production exceeded domestic requirements despite military export demands, and transportation networks delivered fresh ingredients without disrupting other supply priorities. Medical examinations documented systematic malnutrition among German prisoners that reflected homeland conditions rather than combat hardships. Average weight loss of 35 pounds per prisoner indicated civilian food shortages that had affected military personnel before capture, while vitamin deficiency diseases revealed systematic nutritional problems that American abundance would gradually remedy through adequate feeding. The workforce supporting camp food service included civilian contractors, agricultural suppliers, and transportation workers whose casual abundance contradicted German assumptions about American civilian sacrifice during wartime. Food preparation equipment, refrigeration systems, and storage facilities operated without resource constraints that German installations had experienced since 1942. Cultural differences in food preparation reflected systematic advantages that extended beyond agricultural production to encompass social values about individual dignity and collective responsibility. American emphasis on variety, taste, and nutritional balance contrasted with German military tradition that prioritized survival efficiency over dietary satisfaction or personal preferences. International law compliance exceeded Geneva Convention requirements through systematic attention to prisoner welfare that reflected democratic values rather than legal obligations alone. Nutritional standards surpassed minimum requirements, meal variety prevented dietary monotony, and systematic feeding demonstrated humanitarian principles that authoritarian systems had rarely implemented even for their own populations. Personal correspondence regulations allowed German prisoners to describe American treatment in letters home that would gradually undermine Nazi propaganda about enemy brutality, while revealing the systematic nature of American abundance that enabled generous treatment of prisoners while maintaining civilian prosperity that German families could no longer imagine experiencing. The psychological transformation began as German prisoners realized that their captivity provided better nutrition than their families received as free citizens of the Reich, creating moral complexity that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, sacrifice, and national values. The censored letters flowing between Camp Herne and Germany created an unbearable psychological burden for German prisoners who struggled to describe their abundance to families facing systematic starvation. Obergefreiter Muller's weekly correspondence with his wife became exercises in careful omission, as he couldn't bring himself to mention the steaks and desserts while reading about his children's hunger. Greta Muller's letters painted increasingly desperate pictures of civilian conditions that made her husband's prisoner treatment seem like mockery of German suffering. Little Hans asks why the Americans have all the food, she wrote in carefully coded language that avoided censorship. I tell him that good times will return, but I no longer know when. The ration cards provided turnips again this week, but the children need more than I can give them. The psychological complexity of prisoner abundance versus family starvation created moral crises that affected camp discipline, prisoner cooperation, and individual mental health. German soldiers who had been trained to endure hardship for national victory now faced the reality that their capture had improved their living conditions, while their families suffered consequences of the war they had been fighting. Mail distribution became the most emotionally devastating period in camp routine, as prisoners received detailed accounts of civilian hunger that contrasted sharply with their recent meals. Systematic malnutrition in German cities was described through euphemisms that military censors allowed, but prisoners understood perfectly. Mother is getting thinner. The children sleep more now, and we dream of better meals. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a captured German medical officer, documented the psychological effects of abundance guilt among prisoners who struggled with survivor remorse, complicated by the knowledge that their survival was provided by enemies their families had been taught to hate. Depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems increased as the contrast between prisoner treatment and family suffering became more apparent. The camp's social worker, Lieutenant Margaret Chen, whose Chinese-American family had experienced discrimination but found opportunity in America, observed German prisoners grappling with cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda about American brutality and the reality of humanitarian treatment that exceeded what German authorities provided for their own civilians. Personal coping mechanisms included prisoner attempts to share food with family members through impossible logistics, systematic calorie counting to match estimated family rations, and group discussions about post-war responsibility for civilian suffering that German military leadership had enabled through strategic decisions that prioritized military resources over civilian welfare. The educational programs offered at camp included discussions about American agricultural systems, food distribution networks, and social policies that maintained civilian nutrition despite global warfare. These lessons provided German prisoners with systematic knowledge about democratic approaches to resource allocation that contrasted sharply with authoritarian methods they had experienced. Religious services conducted by various chaplains addressed moral questions about accepting enemy generosity while family members suffered, creating theological discussions about duty, survival, and forgiveness that helped prisoners process psychological conflicts between gratitude for treatment and guilt about family circumstances. Work assignments allowed prisoners to contribute to American agricultural production that supplied both civilian and military food requirements, creating ironic situations where German soldiers helped grow food that maintained American abundance while their own families faced systematic starvation that military defeat might be unable to remedy. The letters that broke hearts were not just communications between separated family members, but documentation of systematic failure in German resource allocation that had sacrificed civilian welfare for military objectives that proved unattainable against American industrial capacity that enabled humanitarian treatment even for enemy prisoners. September 1944. The psychological weight of abundance became unbearable for German prisoners, who had gained an average of 22 pounds during American captivity while receiving letters describing family members who had lost 30 pounds or more due to systematic starvation. The moral complexity created by enemy generosity toward prisoners, while German families suffered, created existential crises that challenged fundamental beliefs about duty, sacrifice, and national loyalty. The camp's psychiatric services, headed by Major David Goldman, whose Jewish family had fled Germany in 1938, treated increasing numbers of German prisoners suffering from what would later be recognized as survivor guilt, complicated by the abundance provided by enemies their propaganda had portrayed as barbaric. Depression rates increased as prisoners struggled with the reality that their capture had improved their circumstances while their families faced desperate conditions. Personal coping strategies among prisoners included systematic food refusal as symbolic solidarity with starving families, though American medical staff intervened when such behavior threatened prisoner health. Self-imposed rationing, sharing of portions, and attempted food preservation for impossible shipment. Home reflected desperate attempts to reconcile abundance with family suffering through symbolic gestures that provided psychological relief. The educational programs implemented by camp administrators included discussions about American food production, distribution systems, and social policies that maintained civilian nutrition during wartime. These lessons revealed systematic approaches to resource allocation that prioritized civilian welfare alongside military requirements, contrasting sharply with German policies that had sacrificed civilian nutrition for military objectives. Work therapy assignments allowed prisoners to process guilt through constructive activity that contributed to American agricultural production. German soldiers who had fought to defend their homeland now helped grow food that maintained American abundance, creating complex psychological situations that required careful management to prevent complete emotional breakdown among participants. Religious counseling provided by military chaplains addressed theological questions about accepting enemy charity while family members suffered, creating discussions about moral responsibility, divine providence, and personal duty that helped prisoners develop frameworks for understanding their complex circumstances. Interfaith services accommodated various religious traditions while focusing on universal human dignity. The correspondence regulations were modified to allow prisoners greater freedom in describing their treatment to families, as American authorities recognized that transparency about prisoner conditions might encourage German civilian morale while demonstrating American humanitarian values to enemy populations who had been taught to expect brutality from democratic societies. Personal relationships developed between prisoners and American staff members who shared family photographs, discussed agricultural techniques, and provided individual attention that humanized enemies who had been portrayed as monsters by Nazi propaganda. These interactions created lasting impressions about democratic values and American character that would influence post-war attitudes toward international cooperation. Medical treatment addressed not just physical malnutrition, but psychological trauma associated with family separation, civilian suffering, and moral conflict between gratitude for treatment and loyalty to suffering families. Therapeutic interventions included group discussions, individual counseling, and systematic approaches to processing complex emotional responses to unprecedented circumstances. The transformation process gradually enabled some prisoners to recognize that American abundance represented systematic advantages in social organization rather than temporary wartime allocation. Democratic capitalism had created sustainable prosperity that enabled humanitarian treatment even of enemies, while authoritarian systems had sacrificed civilian welfare for military objectives that proved unattainable against systematic industrial advantages. The guilt that consumed souls was slowly transformed through understanding that individual prisoners bore no responsibility for strategic decisions that had created civilian suffering, while American humanitarian treatment demonstrated values that transcended national boundaries and wartime animosities. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Day arrived at Camp Herne with complex emotions as German prisoners who had gained weight and health during American captivity prepared to return to a homeland devastated by war, occupation, and systematic starvation. The final statistics were devastating. Prisoner mortality rates in American camps were lower than German civilian death rates from hunger-related illnesses during the war's final years. The repatriation process revealed the full magnitude of German civilian suffering that had occurred while prisoners enjoyed American abundance. Medical examinations of returning prisoners showed dramatic health improvements during captivity, while intelligence reports from occupied Germany described systematic malnutrition among civilian populations that exceeded wartime conditions in prisoner camps. Obergefreiter Müller's reunion with his family exposed the moral complexity of his captivity experience through physical evidence that couldn't be denied or rationalized. His own healthy appearance contrasted sharply with his wife's gaunt features and his children's obvious malnutrition, creating personal reckoning with the reality that enemy treatment had exceeded homeland support for civilian welfare. The psychological transformation among German prisoners included comprehensive reassessment of American values, democratic governance, and humanitarian principles that had enabled generous treatment of enemies while German authorities had failed to maintain adequate civilian nutrition despite total control over resource allocation. Personal experience contradicted propaganda claims about American brutality and democratic weakness. Economic lessons learned through prisoner experience included understanding of American agricultural abundance, food distribution systems, and social policies that maintained civilian welfare during wartime. These insights would influence German post-war reconstruction toward democratic governance and market economics rather than centralized planning that had sacrificed civilian needs for military objectives. The personal relationships developed between prisoners and American staff created lasting bonds that transcended wartime animosity through shared human experiences. Former enemies became advocates for international cooperation, democratic values, and humanitarian treatment that respected individual dignity regardless of national origin or wartime status. Educational impact extended beyond individual prisoners to influence families and communities that learned about American society through detailed descriptions of systematic abundance, democratic participation, and social organization that prioritized civilian welfare alongside military objectives. These testimonies challenged Nazi ideology while providing models for post-war social development. Medical data documented systematic health improvements among German prisoners that reflected not just adequate nutrition, but comprehensive health care that exceeded German civilian medical services even during peacetime. American investment in prisoner welfare demonstrated values that prioritized human dignity over revenge or strategic advantage. International implications included demonstration of American humanitarian values that would influence post-war relationships with former enemies. Generous treatment of prisoners created goodwill that facilitated democratic reconstruction while establishing American leadership through moral example rather than military dominance alone. The workforce rehabilitation programs prepared German prisoners for post-war civilian life through technical training, language instruction, and exposure to democratic values that would contribute to German reconstruction along democratic lines. Former enemies became advocates for American-style governance and international cooperation based on mutual respect. Personal testimony from returning prisoners influenced German civilian understanding of American society, democratic governance, and humanitarian values that had enabled systematic abundance while German authorities had failed to maintain civilian welfare. These accounts would contribute to German acceptance of democratic occupation and reconstruction policies. If this profound story of how abundance and starvation revealed the moral complexity of warfare inspired you to learn more about humanity's struggles and triumphs, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales that challenge our understanding of history. The steak and potatoes had represented more than a meal. They had been evidence of systematic advantages that democratic societies possessed through humanitarian values that extended even to enemy soldiers, while authoritarian systems had failed their own civilians.